A very good evening to everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. It is my pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to everybody for a panel discussion on the book Bombay Cinema's Islamicate Histories, edited by Ira Bhaskar and Richard Allen. I'm going to just say a few words and introduce the panelists and moderators of this book discussion. Ira Bhaskar is Professor of Cinema Studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Richard Allen is Professor of Film and Media Art at the School of Creative Media, City University of Hong Kong. Dr. Sagar Tiwari is Associate Professor of History at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. Mahmood Farooqi is an award-winning writer and performer. His efforts in reviving Dastangoi are well known and recognized. Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay is a journalist and author based in Delhi, and Nandini Ramnath is a film editor at The Scroll. Thank you very much for joining us and coming together for this evening. With that, over to you, Ira and Richard, to take this forward and open up the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veenu. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Veenu Luthria and Orin Blackswan for the lovely publication of the South Asia edition of our book and for organizing this book discussion. Thank you for that. Just want to contextualize the publication of this book. Actually, some of the essays, about half of the essays in the book, were first presented at a workshop, seminar workshop in Abu Dhabi in February-March of 2009, when at the end of a festival that Richard and I had worked on and organized, film festival, on these Muslim cultures of Bombay cinema. I'd like to actually ask Richard to come in now and give us the background to that and how the book came about. Richard?
Thanks, Ira. I'd like to add my thanks to Veenu and Oren Blackswan for their magnificent publication, and it was great to work with them on this book. And I'm delighted to be participating in this event today with all these distinguished panelists. So yeah, as Ira said, this book really had its origins quite some time back at 2009 or 2008, when I was then working at New York University, and I was invited to curate a film festival at the then fledgling NYU Abu Dhabi. And already familiar with Indian cinema, I thought that this was a wonderful opportunity to present the Muslim-themed films and Muslim cultures of Indian cinema in the context of Abu Dhabi, because perhaps naively, I felt that this could bring together the Emirati and the South Asian populations into the same space to reflect upon and to have the opportunity to experience this rich body of work. I naturally invited Ira to join in this enterprise, and when we did the festival, we invited a series of very distinguished guests to the event, like Ashutosh Gawaratkar and MS Satyu, Farida Jalal, Syed Mirza, Shyam Benegal, and others. So it was a really wonderful event. And we published a book called Islamicate Cultures of Bombay Cinema, which was a sort of a complement and extension of that festival, which was focusing upon the different genres of Islamicate genres of Bombay cinema. And then we did this conference, and so we developed this book as a response to that conference. Many of the writers there were at the conference, but then we added many new authors to the volume as it grew and changed over what was actually too many years. And really the goal for this book was to go beyond the genre focus of our first book, and to talk about how these idioms pervade the history of Bombay cinema and are diffused within it. they become a kind of part of the warp and woof of that cinema. So that was the idea anyway behind this volume. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you, Richard. Since we are short of time, let's start immediately. And I'm really delighted that all our panelists are here. And we'll begin with Dr. Sagar Tiwari, who will respond to the project and to some of the essays of this book. Sagar?
Yes, Ira. Good evening, everyone. When Professor Ira Bhaskar asked me to comment upon a couple of essays in the volume under discussion, I was quite apprehensive. I am not a cinema studies person who had ever read a pertinent book cover to cover. However, I am a historian who is interested in the current moment in Indian cinema when a flurry of historicals are being produced and released. Last year, we organized a symposium on cinema and history intersection in which Ira spoke. While working towards a collection of papers presented therein, I took up this challenge, thinking that the event will spur me towards learning something new and meaningful. Now, we historians are generally shy of theorization, and only some vitally engage with discourses of arts and aesthetics. My purvagrahas, which are stereotypes or preconceived notions, were strong in this respect, but reading the book slowly across the last few weeks made palpable my own ignorance. So while what I have to say will obviously lack the finesse of a cinema studies scholar, it is a historian's and a Lucknow wala's take on 5 essays in this volume. At best, they are an interloper's comments and should be taken in that spirit. Historians also working upon a new issue first like to learn the discourse surrounding it, identify the gaps therein, and then deploy their own reading of sources to nuance the discourse by either asking new questions or opening up new archives. This is a remarkable volume because it ticks all the above boxes and will be a valuable resource for academics as well as students from a variety of disciplinary vantage points. Also, in the charged times that we are living through, especially when questions of Muslimness, Islam, language, food, dress, etc. Pervade all around us, this present volume seeks to intervene and nuance a discourse which has long spiraled out of control. Bhaskar and Allen's sustained and detailed investigations has spread further from their first book published in 2009. The crisp and historically well-informed introduction to this volume is a robust proof of that evolution. Marshalling the group itself, which consists not only of cinema studies scholars, but also historians, linguists, political scientists, visual studies, English literature and cultural studies scholars to come together is no mean achievement. My favorite essay would certainly be in this volume, Kavita Singh's, which is on Mughal chronicles, words, images, and the gaps between them. It is masterfully done and is true to its title. Essentially, Kavita takes the fabled Mughal miniature paintings and juxtaposes them with the accompanying textual narratives to ask some far-reaching and historically insightful questions. Her analysis claims that the images are at variance with the very text that it illustrates. In focusing upon these gaps, quote unquote, one can conjure up the image of the master artist creating a piece of art transcending the plane of politics and incorporating imperial ideology in the art that the Mughals sponsored to the hilt. She writes that these paintings, and I quote, these paintings are not records of courtly life as much as they are representations of it. But these representations also have a very strong interpretative elements in them. There are interesting arguments about Emperor Akbar, and this is the first time I heard it, that Akbar possibly was a dyslexic person, which sheds a very different kind of light on, we know that Akbar could not read and write, but the very infusion of images in Mughal histories in the time of Akbar were perhaps necessitated by the greatest emperor being a dyslexic. And that is insight which is worth pondering over and taken seriously. So she writes that paintings are not records of courtly life as much as they are representations of it. There are, I mean, as I said, it's masterfully done, but I have just one question for her as a historian. I could not really understand her decision to go backwards in time as the text proceeds. So she proceeds from Shah Jahan to Jahangir to Akbar, which is exactly in the reverse order. If the order would be Akbar, Jahangir, and then Shah Jahan, would her argument change in any substantive ways? Professor Najaf Haidar's essay on Jahangir's notions of love and justice was a treat, and it is purely historical and masterfully executed. The figure of Noor Jahan is also centrally addressed by Professor Haidar. He presents a thorough analysis of exactly how the legend of Jahangir and Noor Jahan were woven into a coherent narrative by selective picking of known historical facts, reports and informations available to later Mughal chroniclers like Khafi Khan. This collage gets depicted in Sohrab Modi's movie Pukar, which comes towards the very end of the essay. Interestingly, Professor Ravi Vasudevan in our symposium had also touched upon this movie, and juxtaposing these two readings could be a fruitful exercise for future scholarship. Shweta Sachdev's essay on Tawaif as a poet and Shikha Jingan's essay on the sonic journey of Ghazal in Bombay cinema are both equally persuasive and meticulously researched ones. Beside minor quibbles on translation, I'm in awe of their scholarship, which reveals the workings of multiple professional layers within the Bombay film industry. However, I have one suggestion which shall perhaps help in giving future work an element of social analysis. Basically, I would suggest that we can also link up the delegitimization of the figure of Tawaif, not only limiting it to the figure of the Tawaif, but also the retinue that she carried. Because Tawaif's performances were audiovisual performances, and they were musicians, singers, poets who fed into the final performance that was given by a Tawaif in her Kotha or Mujra. But after social reform became very strong as the rise of the national movement, there is a certain delegitimization of the Tawaif, and perhaps not only the Tawaif, but also the retinue split. And one of the avenues in which this retinue found future professional work was cinema, was radio. And this trajectory, I thought, was lacking in their analysis, but otherwise very well executed essays. Professor Richard Allen's essay focuses on the practice of parda as shown in several movies across many decades. It is beautifully crafted, which appears at a time when the practice of hijab is in the eye of a veritable storm, with sharp debates happening inside the precincts of the Supreme Court of India. It reminds us that parda was a widely used device in a certain kind of Bombay cinema, and though its depiction has decreased over time, through Allen's essay, we can revisit a better, more innocent age when the mistaken identity it generated fueled the screenplays of successful and iconic movies. I would like to end with a couplet which I first heard in Professor Najaf Haidar's class about 2 decades ago as an MA student, attributed to Ustad Mir Taqi Mir, which reverberates with the parda. साफ छुपते भी नहीं, सामने आते भी नहीं, ये कैसा पर्दा है कि चिलमन से लगे बैठे. शुक्रिया.
खूब पर्दा है कि चिलमन से लगे बैठे. Lovely.
Thank you so much, Sagar. That was really, wonderfully put, and you've stuck to the time, allotted time. So that's very grateful to you for that. Thank you. Mahmood, I hope you will also stick to your time slot.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. I hope I'm audible now. Thank you. I'll try and stick to the time, definitely. So first of all, congratulations to Professor Allen and to IRA for this wonderful volume. And Professor Allen said that it took perhaps too long to come, but actually I think I'm grateful for the time that it took to come, because it has come at a time and at a moment in Indian history and society. This intervention actually becomes more important and even a little radical, because if it had come earlier, we might have taken it for granted. But having come at a time that it has done, when the Islamicate part of Indian cinema and Indian society and Indian history is facing this relentless assault and this kind of a barrage of, eradication and kind of purification, rewriting and reconstructing all kinds of things. So it is a good moment for this book to come. And sometimes, when things take time, there is maybe, some kind of a divine sort of a plan for it. And also the NYU conferences, it so happened that I attended one 3 years later in 2012. There was a wonderful storytelling conference done by the NYU and they were wonderful scholars of the Arabian Nights, of Ramayana and other places. So it was is germane to our discussion also, because one of the scholars there was of the Arabian Nights, and the Arabian Nights, it is so interesting that 2 or 3 of the stories that we are so familiar with, the Aladdin story and the Ali Baba story, are perhaps, Galan's invention, or, this Frenchman who actually popularized the Arabian Nights in Europe, whereafter it became such a rage that, that it actually, some scholars say that it led to this Oriental fascination for Goethe and this whole German Romantic movement. So I liked a lot of the essays in the book. And as I said, I've written a review also about it, which I really enjoyed. The introduction, I agree with Dr. Sagar Tiwari, is very crisp and very informative. The first essay in the book is by Catherine Hansen, a wonderful and one of the great scholars of Parsi theatre. And she writes about Parsi theatre and its origins. And it is so named because it was done by Parsi entrepreneurs. But from a very early time onwards, Parsi theatre, when they tried to adopt Indian themes in the theatricals that they were seeing by European companies, traveling European companies, and they tried to adapt that to the Indian condition. And therefore, the first thing that they lent towards was the Shahnama of Firdausi, from which a lot of the Iranian mythology, the Indo-Iranian mythology, the Dastanic tradition, the Urdu poetry tradition, a lot of it actually goes back to the Shahnameh of Rasiyab and those figures. So from very early times, as Catherine writes, the print culture and the traveling Parsi theatre companies began to draw upon a history of Urdu. And because Urdu itself, the Urdu public culture, the Urdu literary culture was a performative culture, that poetry was always recited aloud and poems were read out aloud. And there were other things associated with that public, that literary culture. Poets actually took on each other and lampooned each other. And sometimes rival poets would take out processions, lampooning the other poet, where their works would be recited and they would be parodied. So there was already an inherent kind of performity to it, which was enhanced by Indar Sabha of Amanat Ali at Wajid Ali Shah's court. So Urdu became a preferred language for Parsi theatre, also because the British were teaching and in Hindustani in schools. In Punjab, Urdu was being studied. In Calcutta, Urdu was being studied. So Hindustani, as Gilchrist said in the late 18th century, was a kind of a lingua franca already. And then the colonial education policies further built on it. And added to that, the Urdu performative culture made it a preferred vehicle for Parsi theatre. And then they started drawing upon the mythology given by Shahnameh, and also developed these contours of a social theatre, mythological, a lot of the musical traditions, a classical tradition, drawing on the folk tradition, going to various places, cities, and whenever they traveled to particular cities, they tried to incorporate the elements or the musical elements of the cultural aspect of that particular city. And it was hybrid and no holds barred. It was, I remember reading Radheshyam Kathavachak's memoir, where he says he did a performance of Krishna Vad or Krishna Janam in Karachi, and he says a line I remember, is that he says, "मैंने उसमें 2 गोरी मेम, 3 हफ्शी और 3 मर्डर भी डाले थे, उसके बावजूद मेरा play नहीं चला." So it was a kind of a no holds barred genre which accommodated a lot of traditions of Urdu. And attached to that is Sunil Sharma's essay, which is again a wonderful essay about the Masnavi tradition and the Persian Masnavi tradition. Some of the most famous genres of that tradition, which merges into the Dastanic tradition, merges into the Urdu poetic tradition, because a lot of those figures formed, long narrative poems were written about Laila Majnu, about Shiri Farhat. And I found it really interesting, that Laila Majnu films were being made not just in Hindi, but also in Malayalam and in other languages. And they were traveling from here to Southeast Asia. Like Indar Sabha had versions in Ceylon, in Sinhalese, and then it was translated into German as well. So it was Laila Majnu films, Shirin Farhat films. A lot of these were drawn from the Persian narrative traditions, and they depicted a kind of a La La Land. And Rosie Thomas's essay really helps us in unraveling what that La La Land was, because this is there's a kind of an Oriental where they'll wear baggy pajamas and there'll be some Arab music. So Rosie's essay really illuminates for us that this was actually called Arab spice music, because Hollywood was using that music to signify signify something Arabic, something Oriental. And I just wish Edward Said had access to this essay, he would have made a few more things out of it, But the fact that there is this whole Arab spice, which Hollywood is using. So what Hollywood is depicting, the way it's depicting the Arab world, actually becomes a signifier of modernity. and signifier of a kind of a transcultural cosmopolitanism, as opposed to the Indian Islamic, which is regarded as sort of regressive and backward. And the Alibaba films then really take off a life of their own from a very early period, from 1904. The first film, she surmises, the first feature film may have been Hira Lal Sen's film of Alibaba. And then she writes about the various Alibaba films that were made down the ages. Mehboob Khan himself began his career as an actor, hidden in a vat in a Mishra film of Alibaba. And then he went on to make himself an Alibaba film. And then Wadia made another Alibaba film. So, I mean, roughly about 15, 20 Alibaba films were made before 1960. And then, MGR made an Alibaba film in Tamil, and NTR made an Alibaba film in Telugu. And, an early Malayali film, one of the earliest Malayali films was Laila Majnu. So there is a kind of a deep sort of roots and deep spread of this Islamicate traditions. And it is something that, so there is this cosmopolitan Arab, there is this Western land somewhere, it could be Iran, it could be, Central Asia, it could be West Asia, it doesn't really matter. And whether it's Islamic or not, it doesn't really matter. But the audiences were accommodative of these various aspects, as they were accommodative of the Parsi theaters, writers like Agha Hashr Kashmiri, writing Hindu mythologicals. And this takes me actually, the whole dress of the Hindu mythological, how we see them being depicted, whether in Amar Chitra Katha comics or Raja Ravi Verma comics, the relationship of that depiction of ancient India visually and the Mughal paintings, is something that I think needs to be explored further. Where do we get this get up, of the sadhu wearing a dhoti and wearing nothing on top, or where do we get the get up of these, heroines in ancient India, the apsaras that Raja Ravi Verma depicts? A lot of that visual reference is perhaps coming from the Mughal gaze and the Mughal understanding of what ancient India looked like, So it is wonderful that our understanding, our sort of purified Hindu understanding of ancient India is perhaps mediated by a kind of a Mughal understanding of what ancient India looked like. And the third, the Philip Ludgendorff's essay is a wonderful excavation and, kind of an examination of a particular Shantaram film. And Shantaram, as we know that, he made some very good films in the beginning. And I just read a wonderful book of essays by Khaja Ahmad Abbas, in which Shantaram was there in a meeting when Khaja Ahmad Abbas held forth about Shantaram's films and then said at the end that these three films, Duniya Na Mane, Padosi and Aadmi, are films that everyone should see again, including Shantaram. But by then Shantaram had gone on to make. Philip investigates this idea of what is pure Indian music and what is pure Indian culture, the culture of tradition, dance, culture of music, where it came from. And in this film, Jhanak Jhanak Payal Baje, okay, I have one more minute. So I'll just, so Jhanak Jhanak Payal Baje, Philip talks about the elision of the Tawaif, the elision of Urdu, and this construction, this attempt to construct a pure lineage for Indian dance and Indian culture, which is unmediated by the foul or the polluting Muslim presence. And that is related to the construction of an ideal ancient India. And that takes us to William Jones and the 18th century and the construction of this ancient Indian past and this history writing, which has now come back to haunt us. And just last one word about this, the essay on Virah and Virahini and Marcia by Kapsik, I think, I'm sorry, Thomas, yeah, forget his name.
Peter Napsik, yeah.
Peter, yeah. So it's a wonderful essay because, this is something which we all felt while watching this whole controversy around Padmavat, that the thing to be outraged was not about what it had done to Hindu, whatever kings, but what it had done to Padmavat, the great Jaisi epic, how it had, totally destroyed that epic and taken it, and gone somewhere. So his contention is, the idea that there is a Virahini, that beloved, who pines for her lover or her beloved and laments through the season, through the different seasons, the Bara Masa. And the Marcia is also where the women are lamenting the loss of their dear ones in battle. And actually now this brings me to what Shamsur Rahman Farooqi very acutely said, the figure of the Urdu poet the protagonist, not the figure, because the protagonist in the poetry is always lamenting, is always shedding copious tears, is always going, he's getting emaciated in the gham, in that thing, is actually the figure of a virahini. It's a female pining for love and the emotions that she undergoes that is depicted in this poetry through the protagonist. And that's why we have all this, copious tears, itna rota raha Mir ki duniya mein sailab aa gaya, aur Mir ne itne gham uthaye ki wo itna dubla ho gaya ki haddiyan uski dikhne lagi. So all of those things actually are, the virahini is very central to that. Although it seems, that the female voice has sort of, disappeared, but the male is actually describing the female voice. I'll come back in the question and answer sessions.
Thank you so much. I mean, I feel, so gratified that all of you are responding to our book, and you seem to have actually got the actual essence of the essays. And thank you very much for that. And Padmavat takes us straight to Nilanjan, who's going to speak about Hilal's essay and also the Qawwali. So Nilanjan, over to you. Nilanjan seems to have frozen. Yeah.
I have had trouble with the link too here. Mine's been going on and off, and I think he might have lost the connection.
I'll maybe we'll go to Nandini then, and he can come back. We can come back to. Is that all right, Vinu?
Yeah, sure. Should I?
Yeah. Nilanjan, are you ready?
I kind of lost the connection. I am ready. I just came back. Okay. I went out and I came back.
Okay, go ahead then.
The connection remains stable.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead then.
It is always very daunting to speak after Mahmood, the great performer, and I will really have to work hard to try to be an equal performer, which I am not. Just a part of mention, I got kind of involved into this discussion courtesy an interview which I did with Ira Bhaskar a few weeks ago as part of a new program which I was starting on one of the websites which has been started. Now, when she approached me, I recalled that I did come into this profession in the early years, primarily because, my writings those days were a spillover from being a film buff during university days. But I made it very clear that I come into this discussion primarily because of having professionally tracked the rise and the growth of the Indian Hindu right wing and the degenerative social fabric of the country for several decades. Now, it is needless to say that the Muslims, Islam, and Islamicate culture exist in this narrative as the primary targets. Now, this troika is forever present at what I call the trisection of cinema, politics, and cricket. The three national passions, which at one point used to be secular but no longer are. Take, for instance, cricket. Till a few years ago, it's only occasionally during India-Pakistan matches would you say that the audiences tend to side with Pakistan. But now you have even Sikh Indian cricket players being targeted because of a poor performance on the field. Now, cinema is actually a very hugely personal experience, and when we were discussing, in fact, with Ira, I was discussing the various essays and the themes that I could focus on. I asked, that if I can focus on her particular essay, the Sufi sacred Qawwali and the songs of Bombay cinema, and Hilal Ahmed's the Muslim presence in Padmavat, the film to which Mahmood also referred to. So I got the word, so I'm going to basically look at these two things. Now, despite being a Bengali by birth, I grew up in North India and in an all-embracing nuclear family with very culturally inclined parents. This is an aspect which I actually also spoken about in the interview with Ira. That is why I'm repeating it. Now, my childhood was often spent watching the two of them singing what I call mock Qawwalis at the various annual day functions in the clubs that were there in our small campus town. But more importantly, we went to these dargahs which were close to the town where I grew up in, and also besides the town, also on the highway to Delhi from the place where I was there. So Now, the Hindi cinema that we watched in those years had a fair share of qawwalis, but the qawwalis we heard in the auditorium and during the annual day events in cinema halls or in cinema halls when we went to see the films, these were completely different from the kind of frenzy and devotion witnessed on the faces of singers that one saw when we went to the dargahs. Now, the questions which came to our mind at that time, I was very young at that time, remained unanswered because my parents did not have possibly the bandwidth, also being engaged into a completely different profession. And with time, I completely forgot these things till the time I actually went and read Ira's essay. Now, she cogently explained how Bombay cinema, the devotional qawwali sung in Sufi dargahs, moved inside homes, palaces, and into urban indoor spaces and stages, and how the theme morphed from being devotional to the romantic, and how instead of the musical form being an instrument to connect one's inner self with the object of devotion, it became a means of entertainment replete with lavish costumes and dances, which became integral to the qawwali form in the Hindi cinema. Now, unity in diversity has become a cliched slogan in India. Even this has come under majoritarian threat. Greater emphasis is now placed on unity and not diversity. It is said that unity is a given and diversity is happenstance. Now, on reading Ira's essay, there is no escaping the realization that Sufism was nothing but a mirror image of the Bhakti movement, at the same period. Now, all this prospered in the medieval era, which is now considered to be the dark centuries of slavery. It was from this period that a lot of Muslim or Islamic elements were drawn into the early and slightly later, maybe the 50s, 60s, and even the 70s, Bombay Hindi cinema. The musical elements, often essential for narrative progression, provided people of different cultures a commonality that they could bond with, without overhyping. Ira establishes how Bombay cinema of that period united diverse groups of people despite their different strands of cultural and religious heritage. Particularly evocative are the textual recreations of the qawwali sequences. I can go on and speak at length as to how evocatively she talks about Mirza Ghalib, Dharmaputra. So I'm leaving that out. But the qawwali's mixed genre, but also the qawwali's mixed genres, but also took out the sacred from the commonly recognized spaces of devotion to underline that faith and its expression needs no space of its own. The essay also establishes how qawwali blurred lines between love and devotion. I particularly found the portions on Shireen Farhad and Barsat Ki Raat as being most evocative. Now, she explained how the Ye Ishq, 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 that entire refrain in Barsat Ki Raat was meant to convey the filmmaker's message that love was free. It was neither Hindu nor Muslim. Love transcends all barriers of class, caste, and religion. Thereafter was the most important point, which was made through, again, the lyrics of the song, that love by itself was a religion. Now, it is extremely ironical that all this one is reading and being reminded of at a time when the campaign against so-called alleged love jihad and against interfaith marriages are part of our political mainstream. Moving on to Hilal Ahmed's essay on Padmavat, and how the controversy took shape, what impact it had on public perception, and how it further buttressed popular imaginations of Muslims. It is a significant essay because it draws attention on ways so-called true history, I use the word true history within quotations, is projected, and how the makers of this film succumbed to sustained majoritarian public pressure, which included physical attacks when the shooting was going on for Padmavat. The essay establishes how the historical genre reinforces dominant imaginations of the Muslims and deepens stereotype images of them. The same was seen in earlier films also, Prithviraj and previously in Panipat. The essay serves a reminder to the existence of pre-censorship and how it forces directors to make films in a way that it does not upset so-called popular perception or popular sentiment. Hilal contends that in Padmavat, Muslim presence is demonstrated by the community's homogeneous character, which is actually not true. The idea that everybody is a replication of the other is the most commonly believed notion, whereas it's completely different. The essay specifies that Muslims are more religious, that this is the way it is communicated through films, that Muslims are more religious, especially the Hindus. The existence of a Muslim look is what has come to be believed by people, that there is a Muslim look. People say, "Tum to Musliman nahi lagte, you don't look like a Muslim." Finally, the film reinforces the belief that Muslims have a specific historicity, and the opposition to Padmavat and other films stem from the insistence of Muslims to draw on the powers of so-called royal and an exotic Islamic past when Hindus were allegedly subjugated. This is a blatantly wrong understanding of history, and the film Padmavat, in fact, reinforces Hindutva campaigns and its imagery of everyday Muslims. The success of the essay actually lies in its easy structure and the manner of establishing the viewpoint. Now, theoretically, it is established that various features that characterize current social imaginations of Muslims. The essay breaks down the protest by the Sri Rajput Karni Sena, the storyline of the film. There are mentions of alterations due to opposition of the film, and how this constantly juxtaposes a typecast Muslim persona with a Rajput who is both a patriot and a nationalist, thereby suggesting that a Muslim cannot be either. Muslim can only be bad and vice versa, that the Hindu can only be perennially good. Padmavat was not made in the way Sanjay Leela Bhansali initially wanted it to. This is the kind of pre-censorship what I am talking about. The essay argues that the protest forced the director to accept as truth the media-driven Hindutva discourse. The essay also argues that the Rajput groups, despite stating that they were committed to protecting Rajput dignity and pride, they do not have any clear ideology, and they're also not very clear about what exactly constitutes Rajput dignity and pride. Where does it get hurt? What exactly is the kind of hurt to it? Similar kind of things that we see in other films also, where so-called Rajput sentiments have been heard, be it Jodha Akbar, or even around, if you move around Rajasthan, you listen to all kinds of stories about the Haldi Ghati narratives, even outside the films. Now, the essay examines how this particular regime has legitimized, with the BJP and its affiliates backing the Rajput groups, suppression of the freedom of expression and polarized a campaign that was historically incorrect. The essay broke down the story and how Rajput women are shown as committing jihad. A vital argument was made on how these women make a sacrifice to protect the nation. But then, does not the act of sacrifice go against the Rajput way of performing an act of bravery? Very important question to think about. Muslim characters in this film, Padmavat, are constantly stereotyped. Alauddin Khilji is shown as a meat-munching man, who goes around, he's unprincipled, lacks in any kinds of moral, a perennial womanizer. Pieces of meat, hang in the backdrop, not like books behind us, but as, in the Mughal court, in the Muslim court, to show that these are barbaric people. And if you eat meat, you have to be a violent person. So which means that to be non-violent, you have to be vegetarian. This is the way also ideologically gets very subtly pushed in the Hindutva ideology. We see all kinds of meat banning campaigns going on throughout the country. The purpose is all this to show is that Khilji, even in his pre-Mewar years, was a villain. It was just a matter of, that he just moved from one villainous setting, one setting where he was a villain, to being a villain after finding Padmavati bewitching. There are several other facets also, in the essay, which one can focus if I had the time. But there is something that I must emphasize. This is possibly the last bit which I'm going to do.
Yeah.
If I'm overstretching, this is it. There is an alliance which is stressed between a Hindu Hindi, the Rashtra, and Singhal, which is a Buddhist kingdom. Now, I find this strikingly similar to the differentiation in today's India between what are called Indic religions and non-Indic religions whose Punya Bhumi, the holy land, is outside, that is Islam and Christianity. Now, Padmavat provides a false narrative, and this essay amply exposes it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nilanjan. Thank you very much. Okay, so Nandini.
Firstly, thank you so much. I'm honored and humbled to be part of this eminent panel. I'm going to bring up the rear. I think I'm just going to make some very general points in my capacity as a journalist and as a critic. The two essays that I sort of responded to and related to me the most were the ones that sort of involve my line of work, in a manner of speaking. One was Ranjani Mazumdar's essay where she looks at surveillance and the role of surveillance in terrorism and conspiracy thrillers, as they are called. She specifically looked at three films, Black Friday by Anurag Kashyap, Amir, which is produced by Anurag Kashyap, and I'm sorry, not produced by Anurag Kashyap, but directed by one of his proteges, Rajkumar Yadav, and Rajkumar Gupta, I apologize, and A Wednesday by Neeraj Pandey. So as a critic and as a journalist, the two kind of genres that I've seen, one has sort of made a roaring comeback, and this is something Nilanjan spoke about, something Sagar spoke about, is the historical. I won't go, I mean, you all have already sort of discussed it very beautifully and eloquently before me. But yeah, it is very strange to observe these kind of strange, marauding Muslims all over the place, fulfilling every kind of stereotype of, you know, what you expect Muslims to be: beards, full eyes, yes, meat eating, violent, aggressive, very foreign. The emphasis on their foreignness and alienness is something which I think is quite recent. In an interview with Ira I had done about, last year, when this book I think was just going into publication, you had talked about how historicals are largely allegorical. And how is the historical really about the past? Or is the film made at a certain time to tell us something about the present? This is a question that Hollywood and European cinema is attempting to answer in good ways. You have a film like The Last Duel, for instance, which Ridley Scott, of all people, made, which is really about Me Too in today's times, but looking at it through a much older incident. You have filmmakers there sort of with varying degrees of success, revisiting chapters of history that are relevant to today's debates. I find as a critic that we are just really regressing to some completely different space. And we are churning out these hystericals with a vengeance to actually say something quite distorted perhaps about the present, or create, as you all have said, a completely false narrative. The other film and the type of series increasingly that I come across is the terrorism conspiracy theory, which Ranjani so beautifully sort of talks about in her essay. Among the things Ranjani discusses is how surveillance, the very act of surveillance, CCTVs, the very geography, the spatial geography of a city, the way it is mapped in the film. Now you have drone footage, for instance, in almost every film and series, you have drone footage. And I think a lot of viewers need to ask themselves, whose eye is that? Why is this drone all over the place? Not everyone can and should be using drones. But she very persuasively argues that the very idea of surveillance, of looking at a section of the population, treating them as sort of regarding them as suspect in many ways, of being collaborators or whatever, is comes out in the very narrative of the film itself. The only one question I had about both Battle of Algiers and Amir is that both of them are sort of heavily inspired by foreign films. Black Friday, sorry. Black Friday is very heavily inspired in structure by Battle of Algiers, which ironically has a completely different political text and subtext to it. It's about, France's colonization of Algeria. And over there, the very same methods of surveillance, of custodial torture, capturing witnesses, hunting down witnesses, has a completely different political aspect. It's a sort of what we call a leftist film nowadays. And to see that completely, the politics of that film completely inverted to do something really not different is very interesting. I wonder what happens to these films in their journey from west to east. Amir, on the other hand, is an unacknowledged remake of a film called Cavite from the Philippines, which has the same ideology as Amir. The Muslims are suspect, they're up to no good, and they're shown as, it's sort of proven by the end of the film. The other essay that I was engaged with and that really interested me despite my own views on the subject is Shoini Ghosh is essay on Salman Khan. It's not one of my favorite actors. But she has the part of her title says a spectral Muslim, which I really think sums up so much of what is going on with this community in Indian cinema and society too. And she talks about the use of Salman's body, his appeal among a certain working class segment, what he represents to young Muslim viewers or Muslim viewers across ages and maybe even across classes. I just want to observe that the Khanate, as we jokingly call it in the film trade, the three great Khans of Hindi cinema, Shah Rukh Khan, Amir Khan, and Salman Khan, are all in their, unfortunately, sort of in the later stages of their career, let's put it this way. Some of them have seen their box office dwindle. Some of them have seen their influence over audiences dwindle. And, you know, it's like Roger Federer retiring a couple of days ago. You are seeing the end of a certain era where I don't think you ever had so many Muslim superstars. We never saw them that way. Now we are seeing them that way. You never saw them being at the top of their game. And none of the leading actors at the moment is non-Muslim, is as a Muslim. They're all non-Muslim, all of them. And I really wonder whether we'll ever have another generation that will come, you know, which will be at the sort of top of the game in this manner. And, you know, how our audiences really sort of looking at this very consciously, or are they just, you know, how conscious are audiences in accepting the fact that not having somebody like Salman, whatever his faults, for instance, what does Salman's absence really mean for the movies? I do hope that, like academics, historians, and critics, even audiences think consciously about the films that they are watching and make conscious decisions about what they watch and what they don't want to watch. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nandini. I think the two essays that you have spoken about really place our sort of project squarely in the contemporary and all the pressures that Muslim communities are facing on a day-to-day basis. Thank you all the panelists, because I mean, I'm just so thrilled and stunned that we could have actually talked about all the essays in the book in this brief 45-minute period. So we'll now open the discussion to audiences and to, if any of you want to pose any questions. And I'd like to invite Richard to take over the question answer session. Richard.
Well, thank you, Ira. I want to echo my appreciation of your copious and thoughtful and so engaged discussion of the book and its essays. It's really a privilege to have that response to this book. We've got a couple of questions online. The first one is from Gopal Tadapalli, and it's, are there any specific aspects of Islam in the movies impacting documentaries featuring Muslims? Now, I don't fully understand this question, but I guess it's about whether or not the kind of representations of Islam that we're or the Islamicate that we're discussing here, how these might inform documentary films. It's not a question I can answer. I don't know whether anyone else wants to speak about this.
I'll just say that, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to ask.
Say that, I mean, I just know of films that have been made looking at, for instance, practices of triple talaq, even before triple talaq was, the union government ruling on it. The films that look at community law, films that look at different aspects of Muslim lives, artisanal communities that happen to be Muslim, for instance. There have been films looking at specific aspect of their lives, but I mean, beyond that, I don't know how else, whether they can be seen as Islamicate documentaries. But there are certainly a whole bunch of documentaries looking at Muslim lives.
I think
the challenge of the question is, of course, that the idioms that we're talking about here are aesthetic idioms by and large. You know, these are forms of expression that get in various ways, you know, dismantled and reconstructed in popular cinema in various ways. So when we're talking about documentaries, I think we're probably talking about something slightly different thematically than the kind of idioms that we find realized in cinema. But yeah, Ira.
No, I just wanted to add that, since there isn't a specific reference, and Nandini has already talked about the kinds of films that have been made, obviously, you know, the way in which social lives are depicted in documentaries, and the way in which modes of interaction, social interaction, are depicted in documentaries will vary depending on the subject matter. So if it's a film on artisanal communities, you know, we may find some Islamicate elements there in terms of the textures of the practice of the crafts, for instance. Or if it's on music, let's say there's a film on Qawwali, you will find Islamicate, you know, aesthetic idioms that will be present there. But clearly, I mean, as Richard points out, in the idioms that we are talking about have developed over century in fiction cinema that was produced, that has been produced from Bombay. So it's a little bit different from just.
Okay. Let's go on to another next question. Rohit Daskapta, thanks for putting together this excellent book, Ira and Richard. Can't wait to read it. I was wondering if you could comment on the courtesan genre. Whilst there are Hindu and Islamic courtesan genres of films, how are they distinguished by the ways in which eroticism, morality, religiosity is expressed? Well, it's funny you asked this question, Rohit, because Ira and I were actually sort of discussing this today, partly. And you know, I had recently written about Neil Kamal, a film that from 1968, and you know, it's a 60s film, and it's a reincarnation story with Wahida Rehman and Raj Kumar, and she is of course she is of course a reincarnation of a Devadasi, and who is in love with the prince in the past. And the film feels to me very much a 60s film. It's and what I mean by that is that it's very engaged with the Khajuraho Kama Sutra imaginary as in the past. You know, it spends a lot of time with the sort of eroticism of the courtesan, of the dancer figure. And I think it's sort of in a displaced way. Of course, it also distances itself from that very much so. She becomes a wife in the present, and she has to exorcise this spirit that, you know, in a sense, she has to detach herself from that past. My point being that the Hindu courtesan film is bound up with this. The imaginaries of the Kama Sutra and the Khajuraho kind of of course, which is a spiritual discourse, but the sexuality is much more overt. And I think this is a difference from the Islamicate courtesan film, but I'm sure Ira would have things to add here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the tension between sexuality, eroticism, and spirituality is very, very deeply sort of ingrained in the Hindu Ganika. You know, that's the word that was used for the courtesan type of figure. The Hindu in the films in which you have a Hindu courtesan figure, and usually these are films that are set in the past. In BC, in Buddha's period, in the Maurya, in time of the Mauryas, and so on. And you know, in a film like Utsav, for instance, you know, really engages in a dialogue with the Kama Sutra and what does the Kama Sutra actually mean, both in erotic terms and in spiritual terms. The Islamicate courtesan film, of course, the wife figure central to this tradition is a figure who's an artist, a poet, a dancer, singer, and who represents the tehzeeb of Lucknowi culture in her art, in her very being. But she is someone who, of course, is denied love and fulfillment herself. Now, the idioms of the Islamicate courtesan film also imbue the figuration of the courtesan in films that are not necessarily courtesan films, but are general films in which courtesans figure. So in Devdas, for instance, when Chandramukhi's figuration, or in another film by Daya Chopra called Sadhana, where Vajayanti Mala is, her whole kotha, how she performs, etc. But maybe Mahmood would like to add, or Sagar would like to add something to this, Mahmood?
Not particularly to this, but I just wanted to address a little bit what Professor Allen said, about this notion of Islamicate, that this was a kind of a heuristically aesthetic aesthetics of the cinema that you were concerned with. But I would say that it's not just about aesthetics, it's also about ethics, it's about a certain ways of comportment, that I had mentioned about the sharafat, for instance. Sharafat is both a code of conduct and a kind of an ethics that you live by, because it requires a certain kind of sacrifice, it requires a certain kind of courtesy, it requires a certain kind of refinement, because a lot of it is drawing from what is called adab, and adab is both literature and conduct, and comportment. And this is how poetry was used. Poetry was used, poetic performances were used both as an entertainment and as a kind of place where you could exemplify the ethics of your society. And that's why poetry was so important, Persian poetry in the cultural exchanges between different kingdoms, and that, each nobleman or rulers had to be well versed in that poetic idiom. And also the other related point is that a lot of it is, even if it's religious, it becomes a part of a performative and thereby gets secularized. Yes. That's why a text like Padmavat can be seen by, the Kathanak, Banarsi Das, he can hear this is a religious thing, but he's hearing it in a kind of a secular entertainment genre. And that's why mythologicals can contain so many extramural secular entertainment kind of things, That's how Vishnu Pad being sung in Sufi dargahs also becomes something that, that gives you a spiritual entree, a kind of a ethics thing. So I would say that, this notion that this is more, it is about aesthetics, it is about language, it is about, expressions, but it is also about a kind of an ideal conduct, of living, norms that you live by. When Amitabh Bachchan sacrifices his life in Sholay, or when he speaks a certain kind of a dialogue in Sharabi, it's still adhering to that notion of sharafat in which, you place the other before you. Like we see a little bit in Shatranj Ki Khiladi, the other always comes first. And then, there is a greater, I would say there is an epistemology and a worldview associated.
Which, right. Actually, Hodgson, actually uses adab as his sort of, when he introduces the idea of the Islamicate and when, defines it in that way. But of course, it also informs the representation of the courtesan as well in the Islamicate courtesan film, and the sense in which the aesthetic performance is a representation of value.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, thank you for that, Mahmood. And
okay, question from Anubhuti Jain. As the passivity of the audience is increasing, we have quite a few questions, and we only have we still have 15 minutes. As the passivity of the audience is increasing, do you think on the part of the audience and producers, the space of inclusivity is being cramped up and will subsequently increase in the coming years? That is, I guess the cramping up will increase. Who wants to take this question?
I don't know if our contributors can respond. I don't
Nandini,
know.
maybe that's a question for you. I mean, do you think that the sort of popular, the sense of this increasing ideological straitjacket governing the popular representation of Islam do you think that is going to change, or do you think this is the kind of new normal that Muslims are portrayed in Bombay cinema just as Arabs are portrayed in American cinema?
I mean, we all know, as academics and historians, you all know this better than me, that so much of this discourse is also manufactured. Some of this, it's not sort of springing out of the soil, but a lot of the trolling, there have been studies, for instance, to show that a lot of the trolling is manufactured and, it's put out there to seem as if it's coming from the so-called constructed public, but we don't know who this public really is, or is it a bunch of bots doing their work from one corner of the country? I do like to believe there are always tensions. This is luckily a very anarchic country. There are a lot of people down south, for instance, who are not affected as deeply by these debates as some of us in the north and in the west perhaps are. I also like to think that, I wonder if younger audiences particularly, do sort of get put off by this discourse and say, I'm not going to listen to somebody on television or on Twitter telling me to boycott something. I'm going to check it out for myself. And we have had films over the last couple of years, Gully Boy, the fact that I think Gully Boy had a Muslim hero after I don't know how many years. It's a fairy tale, but he wins. Ira has talked about Mulk, a film that squarely takes on Islamophobia. So you have examples, you have active sort of attempts to challenge this. There are subtle ways in which filmmakers emphasize diversity. They may not do it as overtly as before. Previously, we know how diversity used to be represented. There was a guy with a sacred thread and a guy with a sort of skull cap, and you would say Hindu, Muslim, bhai, bhai. And some of that was a little sort of in your face and too simplistic, perhaps. But I find some filmmakers who are liberal at heart find ways to smuggle stuff in that the intelligent viewer will sort of get and understand. So I think some of it is pure opportunism. For some filmmakers want to sort of go with the establishment line because it benefits them monetarily and otherwise. But there are ways in which the kind of stories that are being told, maybe you won't touch certain kind of films. Maybe we won't have good historicals for a while, unfortunately. Maybe the courtesan film is dead for now, I don't know. And the terrorism film, unfortunately, is too valuable to let go of. But maybe there are ways to look at this also in a different way. So I think there is tension. You have to look for it, and it's there.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
There was just one little point which I wanted to just intervene and make a mention here. Since
yes.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
It is not that if you actually are true to the political narrative of today that your film is going to be a success. Take, for instance, a film like Padmavat. It was politically correct, historically incorrect, but very much suited as far as the regime's presentation of the history was concerned. Yet it did not do very well. Just a matter of coincidence that...
Not Padma, Prithviraj, you mean?
Yeah,
Prithviraj. Padmavat was a massive...
Yeah, Prithviraj, sorry, my error, Prithviraj. Now, it's just a matter of, just around the time when it was released, we got reports from Ajmer, where there is a kind of a memorial for Prithviraj which was made during the BJP government way back in the 1990s. But it did not generate any great excitement among the tourists who were going to Ajmer. They still went to Ajmer, only went to the Dargah, or maybe around just went to the nearby Jheel and then came back. So it is not that majoritarianism is going to ensure the commercial success of a cinema. A film has to be good. That is the first prerogative, the first reason as to why the audiences would like it.
Yes, yes, thank you. I hope that continues and that audiences continue to discern, Shall we go?
Next question. Let's go to the next question. So this is from Syed Haider. I'm working on a paper that's looking at Muslim characters and supporting roles within LGBT films, mostly as comic decoys. curious what the panel makes of this use and deployment of Muslimness in Hindi films. Well, I don't know the precise films that this is referring to. I don't know whether anybody wants to comment on this.
Does anyone want to comment?
I mean, in general, we don't want poor representations. That we want better representations wherever, whatever the genre of films that may be. But otherwise, I'm not familiar, so I can't say anymore.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, but there is truth that the characters have been caricaturized. I remember, just watching that Qawwali sequence from Barsat Ki Raat, which you mentioned in your chapter. And yes, the person who is sitting right next to the Qawwal from the other side, is actually a person who is projected as a representative of the community, and fair enough, he plays a secondary role. But usually we find that these characters have been caricaturized just the way that they are in society, a very marginal space. So they exist on the margins in society only at red lights, collecting, traffic signals, collecting arms, the similar kind of a presence that they have in Hindi cinema also.
That's right. I think Sagar wanted, yes, go ahead.
If I may add, I'm just reminded of the only perhaps progressive element in Padmavat was the depiction of Malik Kafur, who is this eunuch figure, but a martial eunuch figure.
True.
For once we had, and this is a recorded fact. I mean, this is not untrue. This is
Right.
from the sources that you have a general who is a slave, but is a eunuch, and even the emperor is romantically inclined. I mean,
Yes.
That's right.
it's not a very deep relationship, but the general feels very that song, I think, is
Yeah.
Misriya.
Yes.
Thinkable.
A very good.
Is he portrayed as a general in the film? Does he work as a general in the film?
Yes. I
He
think
participates in the war. And he is actually responsible for the killing of.
He's multi-purpose, actually.
Yeah.
He's a general, he's a spy, he's a procurer, lover.
I
And
think
it's
it's actually
question-
Amir Khusro who has a really bad deal in the film,
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Awful.
That's so what can we say?
Yeah. Richard, go ahead with the question.
Okay, a question from Anupama Prabala. Hello, thank you to the authors for your contributions, the panelists for your excellent discussion questions. I'm so energized by the detailed, astute historicization of different moments in the archaeology of the Islamicate. In the current predominantly identitarian moment, do you think that there's an Islamicate idiom or voice that is available to Muslims? How may a self-proclaimed Muslim artist engage or respond to the register of the Islamicate vis-a-vis popular stereotypes and the majoritarian view? Interesting
Right.
question.
Yeah. Thank you, Anupama, for that. Does anyone else want to take it on? I actually wanted to add to some of the points that all of you were making, which is that the genre that we also need to look at now are the new sort of responses to the Muslim social and the new Muslim social genre. For instance, Mulk begins as a Muslim social and then goes into a courtroom drama form. Also Shahid, begins like that. And but both these films are made by Hindus. But I have just recently discovered a Banaras trilogy made by Zegam Imam, who's made this wonderful film called Nakash and 2 other films, all 3 set in Banaras. And I think Zegam's work is very interesting because he is a Muslim living in Banaras, who has grown up in Banaras, and he is responding to a Hindu city, opening up the city as to being a Muslim city as well. And hence of course his dominant mode is realistic and naturalistic. So some of the melodramatic Islamicate elements are not there, but in terms of mise en scène, in terms of he is mobilizing idioms and languages that of course all of us are familiar with in this particular genre. So I think they are available. At the same time, we also have to take into account that the Islamicate and its presence in India, particularly in India, which is a Hindu majoritarian country, it must be linked to the whole question of majority minority politics as well, and that in many ways the Hindu filmmakers who are making these films, like the classic Muslim socials, were also mobilizing these idioms as a form of tribute, and big filmmakers, big stars were in these films, like Chaudhary Ka Chand and so on, and Mere Mehboob and others. So I think the two points, these two issues, are actually linked, and we also need to respond to that play of politics and identity that is taking place, especially currently. But somebody else may want to respond. Mahmood.
So
question. I'll just go back to that question about, Islamic and Muslims reacting to this, So as a Muslim, as a Muslim actor, if you speak good Urdu and are steeped in this Islamic culture and you have access to the Shairi, in other words, if you are mellifluous, delicate, cultured, then, you are certainly going to be offered a lot of terrorist roles, You'll be offered the role of a terrorist, you'll be offered the role of the Pakistani general. So actually being of this Islamicate will make you moldable to be the villain in the kind of modern films that are coming. And just a point about Zaigam, that what he does with that, so this is actually, one can just say a little bit about, Hindi literature, that, Abdul Bismillah's classic work, Bhini Chadariya, is trying to situate Banaras and its Muslim characters and taking into that city, or the classic work by Rahi Masoom Raza, Adha Gaon. And there has been a kind of a, representation of Muslim culture in various kinds of writers in Hindi. So it's an offshoot of that. I would see Zaigam's work as an offshoot, as in that perspective.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. There are lots of questions. There's also one question in the chat box, Richard.
Yes. So this is a question from Ravindranath Kasinatuni. What are the differences or similarities between Islamicate histories in Hindi movies versus regional Indian cinema? It's a very good question.
Yeah. This will require a lot of work and familiarity.
I just want to say that the one language cinema that has steadily looked at Hindu-Muslim tensions in a way is actually Marathi cinema. There's a whole subgenre of Marathi cinema called the Shivaji film. And all the Shivaji films are essentially about defeating, mostly Muslim invaders, as it were, or enemies. Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan itself is like Aurangzeb's slur in Marathi. To call somebody Afzal Khan is sort of immediately understood what you're getting at. So I think Marathi cinema certainly has that. I would be very curious about Telugu cinema.
I think
given their history.
Malayalam and Malayalam cinema does.
Malayalam seems to have also a lot of contemporary, more social realist, Muslim social variations.
Yes.
And the odd historical, the Mohanlal film where he's he plays the naval chief and so on.
Correct.
And
should we go to the other two questions quickly, Richard?
There's a question here from Renu Abraham. Has the capture of Bombay cinema by Hindutva led to its diminishing appeal in the present? Many recent quote-unquote Hindu historicals, I guess Bombay cinema historicals, have failed at the box office. So that's the opposite, saying that, Hindutva-orientated cinema is leading to the diminishing appeal of Bollywood. I mean, I think that's a kind of complex question, because many people are claiming that Bollywood film is being boycotted for precisely the reasons that Nandini was pointing to, which is that it's identified too heavily with these major Muslim stars, and even Amir Khan's films are now sort of not having the success that he previously had.
No,
Yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, I don't think there is. I mean, a lot of industry people, will tell you that it's very hard to draw a sort of straight line from an online campaign for a boycott, which we don't know. Like I said earlier, is it a real debate? Is it a manufactured debate? We have to be really careful about assuming this stuff is actually happening in our real lives in the street, right? There is no, and to prove decisively that Lal Singh Chaddha was boycotted. Maybe, like Ira said, if your film isn't good, it doesn't matter. People are not going to watch it. Afterwards, you can ascribe whatever reason you want to it. Brahmastra, for instance.
This question is asking the opposite, or suggesting the opposite possibility, which is that the influence of Hindutva on popular cinema is leading to its diminishing appeal. But
I mean, from where I sit, which is arguably a sort of much like a narrow position, I don't think, like I said before, there are tensions. There are films that are working despite the supposed boycott. Called Brahmastra is a good example. Whatever the themes of the film and whatever its treatment and so on, I think it's a little early perhaps to make that leap that Hindi cinema is on its last legs.
Right. And if you look at a film like RRR, I mean, it seems to me, strongly bathed in Hindutva politics.
Yeah.
And it was a roaring success.
But the film that made the most money this year was KGF 2, which made over 400 crores, which is like bringing back Amitabh Bachchan's angry young man figure, reinventing him for new times and new audiences.
Right.
I think
it's implausible to make any kind of generalizations on these things, because there's also the diffusion of the film market as well, and the availability of so many different kinds of viewing in today's mediascape, which is going to affect first-run Bollywood films.
Richard, I'll just quickly read out the question in Hindi, and
is it a question? It didn't.
No, it's a comment. It just says, I think we just have to agree with it. Padmavat ke 3 star hai. Pehla ऐतिहासिक, दूसरा जैसी संदर्भ, और तीसरा cinema. And obviously the answer to that is yes. But maybe you'd like to just read out Shweta's comment and Shikha's comment. And Ravikant has a question as well. So if you can just do them all together, because we're
running out of time. Yeah. So Shweta makes this comment. We mentioned Gali Boy. She mentions, a good example, lipstick under my burqa as a more sophisticated treatment of Muslim themes. Ravikant.
Read out Shikha's first, because that's a comment. And then we can do Shikha's is at the end.
Oh, right at the end. Oh, yeah, that just came in. Okay, one needs to see film songs as an umbrella category, which includes ghazals, nazam, qawwali, and other musical genres, like a song about loss of love, which straddled different kinds of cinema, Islamicate or not, and the ways they were presented by radio anchors with a certain kind of voice, Urdu diction, and a certain oral performance of the voice. This is in response to the question about the Tawayif.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And maybe Ravikant now?
Congratulations, Ira and Richard. Has the volume dealt with non-elite, non-Tawayif Islamicate films? Well, I think that the answer there is that there is a very, I think, interesting essay in the book by Rosie Thomas on the Oriental genre, which was briefly discussed in one of the presentations.
We need to
non-elite films.
Yeah, I think we need the new Muslim social. We need to talk about the new Muslim social in response to Ravikant's question, because these are, this particular book is not genre oriented, and it looks at elements and idioms. So no, there isn't an essay in this that does what you are asking, Ravi.
No,
There are-
we mentioned that in the introduction, but
Yeah.
there's not an actual essay in the book.
Right, right. So we have,
say, Nandini's, just thinking about, boycott and its impact. It is very complicated, and as she's rightly saying that we don't know whether any boycotting trends actually have an impact. If the film is good, it might do well. But sometimes, propaganda films, like one of the biggest hits of this year, I have not seen the film, so I can't comment on its quality, but I think a moment has come when propaganda can propel a film to a certain kind of success. But at the same time, one has to acknowledge that about the Khans, there has been a sustained campaign to vilify
Yes.
them, which doesn't have to do with the boycotting trend. And a lot of people have been affected by that. It has been circulating in WhatsApp groups. People now make it a statement of pride that they don't watch any of the Khan's films, and it's an assertion of a certain kind of cleanliness, of a certain kind of purity, and that we should also be mindful of.
I mean, there are already comments about Pathan, Shah Rukh Khan's new upcoming film in January, which are really quite horrendous. Yeah, that's true.
There's also one suggestion for an area of study which could be done, especially track the Hindu right-wing periodicals, as to what are they writing on cinema, how is appreciation being done, say in Panjanya or in Organizer or in other volumes. I think it is going to give a lot of ideas as to how the right wing's mind is working. We cannot ignore the fact that Mr. Advani started out as a film writer and he's been a very avid film buff through his entire life. So while being in this discussion, it suddenly struck me that I should try to find out which were the articles that Mr. Advani wrote as a film writer. It would be very worthwhile, I'm sure.
True.
I'll seriously make an effort to get them out.
Please do that. We look forward to that. Sagar has a comment. Sagar, do you want to read it out?
No, because RRR was being talked about, and I work on tribes and Adivasis, and it is the most atrocious kind of movie that could have been made on tribes. I saw it with a lot of, it's hard to describe my feelings.
Right. Yeah.
But what I'm suggesting is that it is very difficult to dislodge narratives within Bollywood through a project of capturing Bollywood. In Caravan, there was this piece on Kangana Ranaut, and they call it the Battle for Bollywood, where she is playing some kind of a leading role as this wannabe icon, and you see a lot of upcoming artists and sports stars who are actively endorsing the current regime, because we know that artists and sportsmen, they have a shelf life which is limited, and they would like to maybe take the leap of a few years down the line when the stars are appropriate. So it's something that cannot be predicted. It's a project, yes, but all projects find stumbling blocks. And as a historian, I always believe in the force of the contingent, which put speed breakers on projects, and that will come. It is building up. In what form it will come, no one can predict, but it will come. We are 1/6 of humanity. We can't.
That's wonderful to hear, Sagar. I mean, that's really wonderful.
But it's just that the little skepticism, to inject a little skepticism into what you said. Last week I was at the release of Ashok Vajpayee's poems, where he's a modernist who's always been, for the written word, the autonomy of the writer. And Apurvanand raised this question, head on. He said, at a time like this, swayatata hai kavi ki ya lekhak ki, that the writer is operating in some kind of an autonomous zone, which remains unaffected by everything that is going around us, is to be very naive, to think that we can still be in that kind of a realm where the artist has a certain autonomy or a certain freedom or a certain, privileged space of truth and truth telling and truth value. But we're all with your optimism, inshallah.
No, inshallah, all efforts by all of us hopefully will someday bear fruit. Let's see.
I'm afraid with that, we will have to bring a close to this exciting discussion. Thank you for this hugely fascinating and engaging discussion on this richly illustrated and scholarly collection of essays. Ira, Richard, Sagar, Mahmood, Nilanjan, and Nandini. Thank you, attendees, for joining us today. Good night and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ira.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.